Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Through the Bible study. We have officially finished our first book with 65 more to go. So, without further ado, we will begin in Exodus, which, if you weren't doing the numbers, 66 books in the Bible, one down, we're on the second. The book of Exodus, this was the documentation, historically narrating Israel's travelings out of the nation of Israel, because simply put, the word Exodus means exit, and exit motivated by religious motivation. Historically, given the antiquities that go in line with what we're going to be talking about here, it's not only picking up where we left off in Genesis chronologically, historically, but also theatrically. We would notice that God left no sense of irony out of everything that he was doing, not only in and through the lives of his nation Israel in the previous chapters that we've discussed, with the whole humorous ordeal with Joseph and Judah, Reuben, Dinah, and Tamar, and all of those interesting series of events, but also in the introduction of another major biblical character, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, the man by the name of Moses. We're going to be meeting him today and seeing the rather impressive start to his ministry, but not going down to when he was in his 30s, even his 20s, but all the way down to when he was but 3 months old. He was already being used by God in powerful ways. Or rather, God was doing things in his life that he has no shortage of an opportunity to say thank you for. So, in verse 1 of chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man of his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. These were the descendants of Jacob, were 70 persons. For Joseph, there's the 12th, was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. So, recap to where we left off in Genesis, Joseph is used by God powerfully to save Egypt. It's a world-ruling empire. He is not only the reason why they have the political influence that they have in that time, but also the reason why they have any food in their stomachs to speak of, as far as any nation goes in that time. Given a prophetic gift by God, an advance warning, they not only bear the blessings of God, but also demonstrate them actively, in that even though every single one of the foundations, the progenitors, if you will, of the 12 tribes of Israel have all passed on, and rightfully so, because the time gap between Exodus and Genesis is 400 years. But the first word of Exodus actually shows that Genesis and Exodus weren't separate books. It was a continued document known as the Pentateuch, which God dictated to Moses, not only concerning Israel's far-off history, but their current history and what they were being given concerning the law, which is Book 3, Numbers, is their journeys through the wilderness, and Book 4 and Book 5, Deuteronomy, is Moses' last sermons before he would pass away and leave the nation of Israel to Joshua, which is Book 6. So this consecutive order, I will be sure to be the first to tell you, and as well, I'm sure for most of you listening to these studies have done your homework to know when the chronological order gets put into separate issues, but the historical narrative of Israel and their interactions goes all the way into Chronicles. And this beginning from Genesis all the way to then, it's only there that we then transition into the poetry of the Hebrews, which includes Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and then we get into the third section of the Old Testament, which is known as the prophets, and they have their own chronological system, which we will be going into great detail as to which and when and where, which is why we're going to do the history first. Then we'll get into the fun stuff. Oh, it's all fun, but we're going to get into it regardless. 400 years have passed, and God's promise was fulfilled to the letter. Genesis 46 and verse 3. So he said, talking to Jacob. He was wondering whether or not he was supposed to go down to Egypt or if he was supposed to stay in Canaan, because that's where God's promises were. That was the promised land, as it was so famously called. He said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hands on your eyes. So this was a promise not only to Jacob, to Israel, that he would go to Egypt with God's full blessing, but that also that blessing implied he would come back. That not only was included in how he wanted to be buried back in the promised land, but also to recognize, know, and remember that they would leave Egypt under the same circumstances in which they came, directly led by God's supernatural provision. Now, what was the setup, of these events? Verse 8, Now there arose a new king over Egypt, naturally, over 400 years. I'm sure a number of kings had passed, who did not know Joseph. That's the key issue. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened, in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses. So, with an interesting logic in the heart and mind of the Pharaoh, we talked about this in the last study when we were concluding the book of Genesis, that ungratefulness is the foundational root and fruit of someone forgetting history. Joseph was the reason. The Jews were the reason why Egypt had, anything to say as far as world scenes, let alone all of them even being alive to that day. He was the one who provided them food. He was the one who carried God's blessings to that nation. He was the one who really, for all intents and purposes, made Egypt an empire and not just another city with a military behind it. But who cares about some guy that did something 400 years ago? Is this starting to sound so much like our culture? Understand, Israel was put into slavery by a king who thought the best way to keep a people from living in his land for reasons beyond just pure sheer loyalty and wanting to be supportive of Egypt. It was first a fear of when foreigners were occupying your land, that if we faced an invader, then you would have to deal with civil war, and by the philosophy of Jesus pointing this out, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. They understood this. So what does Pharaoh do to ensure Israel's loyalty? Let's make life miserable for them. That surely won't cause any rebellions or riots. Well, here's the interesting thing. Israel's character was a lot more stable than the Pharaoh's mental faculties. Verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. Now note, God continues to bless them, and what happens? It only produces fear in Egypt. No rebellions, no riots, just continuing to live in Egypt, and they were a national threat because good things were still happening to them. Now, you got to consider really what's happening here. The inspiration and interaction of Satan in the hearts and lives of individuals is so often dramatized by movies like The Exorcist that if you have demonic activity going in your life and there's pea soup being vomited all over the walls, you're floating and they're pointing the cross at you but he's fighting back and the girl's head's turning around and all this different stuff, it's really a lot more simple than that, because do you understand there are more than enough influences the enemy can use in our lives to completely paralyze us from spiritual growth beyond that of just outright assault and demonic affliction? What I'm referring to is the issue of fear. The enemy loves it almost as much as pride, because it's the foundation of what he gives to those who serve him. You fear the loss of that next high. You desire that peace that those things that you're in bondage to give you. You are afraid of death, so you cling as much as you can to life and reject anything that reminds you of it, ultimately hastening that process. The book of 2 Timothy, chapter 1 and verse 7, I think, points it out in antithesis and flip-flop to this, to confirm the logic we're talking about here. 2 Timothy 1:7, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. So if that is what is the definite result of what a fellowship and relationship with God ultimately produces, then what's the flip side? What do you think the opposite of not God, but interaction with Him, the opposite of His character melding off and affecting your life, is going to produce? Well, instead of, naturally, He hasn't given you a spirit of fear, so what is the foundation of the enemy's spirit and impact in your life? Fear, certainly. Vulnerability instead of power, that's certainly what Egypt was experiencing. Even though there was no threat, even though the Israelites, bearing the honor of their ancestors to be not only good citizens but good witnesses of the God that they worshipped and served, continued to be good citizens despite being treated so harshly, and of a sound mind. How about sheer insanity? Verse 13. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, meaning they started to enact harsh, forced labor on them. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, and mortar, and brick, and all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. And this is where it gets really sad. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom one of which was named Shiphrah, and the other name was Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. Now, I'll go on to finish the rest of the chapter, but do you understand what's being implemented here? Government mandated abortion on any male, so that when the Hebrew women are absorbed and married by Egyptian men, they lose their cultural identity, that the nation of Israel essentially is wiped out and abolished and absorbed as just another culture like any other nation would have, given a separate cultural identity. Understand, the nation of Israel is a walking, talking miracle, not only historically, but, well, economically, militarily, spiritually, socially, culturally. Everything about them should by no means exist unless the God that they served was real. That everything that has been happening to them throughout history, both present, near, and far, if there wasn't a supernatural power holding them together, they should have been wiped out, not only by themselves, which we'll talk about in Numbers and later into Exodus as well, but by other nations which should have had plenty of opportunities to just meld and absorb them. Yet something held them together. Something gave them that cultural identity as Jews that prevented them from being absorbed into any other nation and culture. Note, the Samaritans were noted to compromise, but they still always knew who they were. We'll talk about them when we get into the books of 2 Kings and as well into the Gospels, when it discusses the Samaritan compromisers in detail. Isaiah as well. But with all of these things being pointed out, understand this forced labor, this genocide, infanticide, I guess would be the term for it, they encouraged, if not mandated through Congress-passed law, that if you were Jewish and you had a boy, they would be aborted at birth. But here's the interesting thing. But the midwives, verse 17, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So when the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? They violated a court order. That's grounds to get you arrested. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, well, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively. That's an interesting term for someone giving birth. And they give birth to the midwife. They give birth before the midwives come to them. It's too late. The baby's already acclimated. Therefore, verse 20, God dwelt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew mightily. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. He blessed them in the midst of his people, not because they were a part of him, but because they obeyed God and what was right before what the government told them to do. Note, good citizens, representative, fear God, honor the king, 2 Peter 2, right? But understand as well, if the government tells us to do something in disobedience to God, we obey the one who gave them that authority beforehand. But if what they are asking of us, like asking for taxes, asking for public service, asking for identification, I mean, this was, 2 Peter was written during the time of Caesar Nero, and if he said honor the king, who was the emperor at that time, who are we to complain about who got elected in office? Now, granted, nothing would bless me more than to see a godly man in office, but understand, right now, President Barack Obama is in office, and whoever is going to be elected at the end of this year during the time of this recording, as a Christian, I am morally, spiritually, and personally obligated as an American citizen to submit and obey him. Now note, he throws me into prison for teaching the Bible and promoting hate speech because it offends some people. I obey God before man. But if he asks for taxation, I pay it. If he asks me for public decency and no exposure, I respect it. If he enforces traffic laws, I honor that. I love the people in blue who make the streets safe for me. But understand, these women, these midwives, by honoring God, were disobeying the government. And rightly so, because it had kind of gone a little nutty. Pharaoh commanded all his people, not just the hospitals, every son whom is born to you shall be cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Now, in chapter 2, we get into this introduction of a very interesting character, a man of the house of Levi. You remember Levi. Him and Simeon went on their rageaholic streak, I guess is a nice way to put it. But knowing that their temperament, which also would genetically carry over into this individual, did not keep them from their calling by God, but simply delayed it, we're going to be introduced to a very special individual. A man of the house of Levi also took as a wife a daughter of Levi. This isn't incest, this is classic relation in ancestors. If majority of my blood is Dutch, so if I marry another Dutch girl, it's the same principle. Most American citizens, we got 1/16 Cherokee in all of us, so if we marry another person with 16 Cherokee, it's that family lineage, it's that bloodline of Israeli people who not only married within their nation, but also within their respected tribes. But they kept genealogies to know and recognize when and where those bloodlines would be either too short or too, broader the better. But we'll talk about that when we get into the law. And so the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, this not only refers to physical appearance, but spiritual promise, she hid him 3 months. So, she had a boy. Martial law is in effect. If you have a baby boy, you're supposed to strangle him before his first bath. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt. Interesting. Anyway, you're reading the same book I am. Sometimes they only include half the word, and you have to pronounce only half of it, and then you realize it's too late. Humor me. And pitch, and put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside, to make sure no one was spying. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the baby child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So, essentially, having no shortage of irony and sense of humor here, Moses, who was unnamed at this point, was hidden from the government abortion laws by his parents. They are actually given a passage in Hebrews 11 and verse 23 where his parents by faith hid Moses, knowing that God's promises on his life would be great ones. They trusted and honored God before obeying the psychotic government, and after 3 months of hiding this baby, I mean, that's impressive, she obeyed the law to the letter. She threw all babies into the river. No one said I couldn't put them in an ark. A little driftweed with waterproofed pitch and asphalt surrounding it so that it'd float. And I threw the baby in the river. You can't hold that against me. Funny. Anyway, eventually it drifted down to Pharaoh's daughter while she was bathing, and when she saw the baby, she fell in love. She's like, I want to take it home. There's actually a tradition that when the lid was lifted off the baby, that an angel pinched Moses' little toe so that he'd cry out and warm the heart of Pharaoh's daughter. It's not biblical by any means, but I think it's a cute story. And wanting to take this baby home, verse 7, remember who's following the river? Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse him for me, and this is the best part, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, literally in Hebrew, Moshe, which means saying, because I drew him out of the water. Moses literally means to draw out. So, quick recap here on the most ironic set of circumstances conceivable, if not to the fact that our origins of sense of humor come from no other than God himself. Miriam, Moses' older sister, volunteers Moses' biological mother to nurse her own child as a nanny on Pharaoh's dime. Now, consider this first, the irony of all of this. Who was trying to kill Moses? I mean, ultimately, likely inspired by Satan, now is paying in cash the raising of the child that he was inspired to kill. I mean, not only to ineffectively wipe out the nation of Israel, violating God's promise that your generation will endure until the end of the age, that through you all nations would be blessed, that Satan was inadvertently trying to prevent the Messiah's coming by wiping out his progenitors and having to resort God to plan B, of which there was none. God had invested everything in this nation, which is why they face the persecution that they do even to this day. And note, if you're an anti-Semite, consider the fact of who's inspiring that. You cannot call yourself a Christian and hate God's people, even if they aren't the most pleasant people to be around. They have been called in part to blindness until God fulfills their plans for them. Until then, if you don't respect them, recognize you're disobeying, dishonoring, and disturbing what God calls the apple of his eye. That's the cornea, right here, the part that you don't want to touch. Remember that. Now, humor and seriousness aside, they continue. Verse 11. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, he was around 40 years old at this time, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So, likely, what's happening here is, first off, consider culture. How long was Moses taken care of and nannied by his mother Jochebed and his father Amram before being brought up to Pharaoh? Actually, according to most ancient customs that we have archives to confirm about, kids were nursed at times often until they were around 13 years old. I'm talking like braces being an issue at this point. And I know some of you got like, ugh, but consider Jochebed daily praying over this child, speaking life into him, reminding him, you're not an Egyptian, you're a Hebrew, you've been called by God to deliver us. You have a special calling, you have a special destiny. Your life is to bring life and save the lives of your brothers and your sisters in God. And when he saw this, he understood, in part, what the calling of his life was. So, verse 12, he looked this way, and he looked that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, while he did understand, in part, what his destiny would ultimately accomplish, to be a deliverer of Israel from the tyranny of the Egyptians, let's fast forward here 11 chapters. In Exodus 13, it says that his destiny was ultimately culminated and fulfilled. Remember the parting of the Red Sea? When Israel crossed that impassable terrain, as D&D players would refer it to, Moses raised up his staff, and God caused the winds to cease, and the Red Sea collapsed on the Egyptian army pursuing them, literally burying successfully the entire Egyptian army underwater and in the sand in an instant, and in self-defense, as well as the defense of God's people, so legally, morally, and heroically. God's plan for Moses' life would be to bury the Egyptian army in defense of his people. Verse 13. And when he went out the second day, 2 days had passed, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, whose fault it was about the argument, why are you striking your companion? Then he said to me, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Oh, junk. Tabloids were telling the truth. Word got out, gossip spread, and Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Now, let's rewind 2 verses. Moses' destiny: bury the entire Egyptian army, and in a way that was honorable. 2 verses earlier than this, Moses failed to kill and bury 1 Egyptian, and became a murderer in the process. Now, recognize, what was he missing as far as his destiny was concerned? Well, he'd have to spend the next 40 years of his life trying to find that out, hiding in the desert. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So literally, having lost his reputation, his status, his education, and his promise as a leader of nations, being groomed as not only a military commander, but also as a public speaker, as an inspiring and efficient politician, an economics major, literally everything that you'd want and expect from a nation and leader, Moses lost everything because he acted without the one thing that makes all of our lives either worth nothing or everything in the same notion. Moses became a murderer, and knowing that just like with Simeon and Levi, God knows how to work in a prison sentence and a blessing and opportunity to use them at the same time. Recognize defects, character flaws, oftentimes passed down through the family. And you remember with the Dinah incident, when we talked about this in Genesis, that Simeon and Levi in Genesis 49 were noted as having very little inheritance but their wicked tempers. And this would actually be a stumbling block for Moses' spiritual growth and walk with God for many years to come. But also recognizing the fact that while murder is murder, and God had a plan for Moses' life that was significantly delayed until he turned 80 years old, it wasn't canceled. God still was going to use him. It was just merely delayed by the consequences of the actions that he ended up taking into his own hands, barely even scratching the surface of what he could have accomplished through God. So losing his reputation as a prince, we see that even though he doesn't have a crown on his head, he still has the mind and the heart of a nice guy. Now, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled their troughs with water, to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds, these mean neighborhood boys, came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Ruel, and those of you guys don't know, Jethro is another good name for him, their father, he said, "How is it that you have come so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flocks." So consider what's happening here. This is a common occurrence. The girls go out to draw water out of the well. They fill it up in the big old metal canister so all the animals can drink. But then the mean neighborhood boys drive the girls away after they did all the work of putting in the water and feed their own or water their own flocks instead, so that they have to go and do it all over again. They come home on normal time, and Jethro's asking, "Why you guys home so early? Did the neighborhood boys not give you any trouble?" Because, I mean, first off, Jethro's likely an old man. He can't really do much to defend his daughters beyond just poor reputation, and no one's going to expect much out of the shepherds anyway. It wasn't really considered a high-class job, let alone the reason why Egyptians didn't like shepherds. They hadn't made a good name for themselves. They tell their dad about this really nice guy who came by and helped them out. And Jethro's response is really kind of hilarious. He said to his daughters, verse 20, "Where is he? Why is it you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." Girls, I've been trying to get you guys married. You found a good guy and you just left him there? Bring him home. I tried to get you girls a date with some decent fellow. The guy finally comes to you and you just left him? Come on. Use your heads. So Moses is welcomed into their home. Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, nice little Midian girl, his daughter to Moses, and she bore him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." And literally the name Gershom means stranger there. So not unlike Joseph when he was spending his time in Egypt in a strange land. Ephraim and Manasseh, fruitfulness and forgetfulness. God blessed him abundantly and caused him to forget his former grief and pain. Just like Moses' namesake, these would be very precious times and moments, because even though this is technically, for all intents and purposes, a 40-year prison sentence for committing murder, that God is not letting Moses get away with the crimes that he committed, his life spent hiding in the desert would ultimately result in him actually fulfilling to the letter what God intended for him, because we read in verse 23 of chapter 2, it happened in the process of time, over the years that Moses was in the wilderness, the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Now, recognize what this isn't saying before we talk about what it is. God didn't forget. He just remembered. His timing is perfect. When you recognize something in it from an omniscient, I think is the proper word, someone who knows everything, do you even have to think? But according to your own timetable, you only act during those specific time periods. Like we mentioned earlier, the famous wizard from the Lord of the Rings series and character by J.R. Tolkien, "A wizard is never early, Frodo Baggins, nor is he late. He arrives precisely when he means to." And at times we wish God was early, and at times we feel God is late, but understand, neither or. He knew that now was the time to not only know perfectly the day that God would lead them out of the nation, but that God specifically allowed things to get very, very difficult for them before doing so. And why? Because it would make them want to leave. Consider if you had been living, the United States of America has only been a country for almost 300 years at this point. Israel had been in Egypt in 400 years. Do you think they might have been settled down at this point? I mean, I'm not content to move and change my cultural identity, no matter what my great-great-great-great-great-grandparents said. Unless, of course, this nation has gotten so lousy to live in, I would be happy to go anywhere as long as it wasn't here. Oh, God's stacking the deck in his favor. Do you see the point? God allows difficult things so that you want to move and go beyond. Maybe because you're going through such difficult circumstances in your life, it's because God wants you to know what it feels like not to have him, so that when you finally do come to him, he could bless you. Think about it. So, chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. So we can confirm who this fellow by the name of Ruel's name actually was. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now this is what would famously be their rallying point later on in Exodus, where they would be given the Ten Commandments. And the angel of the Lord, there's that theophany again, God's interaction with man, literally, Malek Yahweh, God having a message, appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. You guys remember this story. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses says, I will now turn aside to see this great sight as to why the bush was not burned. He sees this and that's not normal. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen Jim Gaffigan's routine and saying sure he did. Maybe Moses, you've been burning some bush. Understand, this wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't some bizarre set of circumstances or heat stroke. This was actually a legitimate interaction with God in a way that would get Moses' attention. Because understand for a moment, Egyptians loved their magic shows, didn't they? What was the best way to get their attention? Remember Joseph interacting with the two prisoners in the Egyptian prison? How did God get their attention so that Joseph could flex his spiritual muscles and know that God hadn't abandoned him yet, and set him up for interaction with Pharaoh, fulfilling God's plan for his life? Oh, it was the bizarre, mysterious dreams, along with giving Joseph the means to interpret them. Does that mean that God's the only way he interacts with people is through bizarre and symbolic mysteries, and the only way we can interpret the Bible is through these vague prophecies that we have to trust the pastors to interpret for us? No. But he does know when we're listening and what's going to get our attention, and at times he has to speak in different ways to different people. And for the last 40 years, what has Moses been doing in the spiritual realm? Nada. So he had to pick up where he left off. So when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, when he got his attention, God called to him in the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Who is it? And he said, Do not draw near this place. Take the sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Now, you guys are probably familiar with this custom in Asian homes. In Oriental customs and communities, they do this as a sign of respect in regard to not only places of sacred homes, but in the homes of people as a sign of respect. You take off your shoes before entering in. They do this in schools as well. And this isn't just to prevent the accumulation of foot odor, but it's also to recognize the respect of the person you're stepping in the presence into. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now, the movie The Prince of Egypt didn't stick to the book of Exodus quite to the detail that I would like, but they still did a fantastic job, if anything else than just illustrating this scene and God's miraculous interaction, and the ways he had to intervene with the priests of Pharaoh and the magicians and sorcerers and how they interacted. Because understand, it wasn't demonic power. It was just smokes and mirrors. Satan's a liar and the father of it. And I actually know very talented magicians who use their talents in art and skill and craft for the glory of God. And they understand that it's just really just replicating movie effects, getting people to look certain places to wow their eyes. And we'll talk more about this when we continue the book of Exodus, but just going over this into brief points, God's interaction with Moses was literally getting to meet what was missing concerning his calling on his life. That, well, for all intents and purposes, just like that, noting a serious change of character on Moses' part shows that in the first phase, what would he have said 40 years earlier? Being trained as the king of Egypt. And he's just like, oh, I've called you to lead Israel. It's like, oh, about time, God, bring it on. About time to lead the nation. Now, 40 years later, of getting to recognize who he really was, living as a shepherd for his father-in-law, after being kicked out by his family for his stupid decision to try and kill someone or avenge of someone that he prayed wouldn't notice. What happened? Oh. Now he's saying, oh, I'm so imperfect, I'm not worthy to look at you, God. That's the person God can use. Someone who recognizes their desperate need for his resources and none of their own. So, verse 7, Lord says, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. Therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come up to me, where I have also seen the oppression of the Egyptians who oppressed them. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And then Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Now again, reiteration on that character part, right? Who am I to lead these people? In fact, if you want to just pause this study, go into the Google search box if you're watching this on video and just type in Prince of Egypt burning bush scene, because it just illustrates this interaction beautifully. It doesn't leave in every detail, but it focuses on the main point of just how magnificent they represented God's character and how he was speaking to him. He overviews God's plan for Moses' life as the liberator of Israel, and what's his response? Who am I to do such a thing if it's not without you? Wow. Now here's the really cool part. So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you when I have brought the people out of Egypt. You shall serve God on this mountain. Just like I promised your ancestors that you would leave Egypt, I'm promising you, you're going to see this mountain again. Where you spoke to me, we're going to talk again. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say, what is his name? Got like a secret handshake or code? I'm not familiar with this policy. What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now recognize that title, I am. Literally, the language would suggest the becoming one is how this phrase would pan out. And that's how he relates to us, eternal in nature, complete in provision. He's not the I was, he's not the I'm going to be, he's always I am. Complete in provision and perfect in power and love. What are the questions that we ask God? I need a Savior. God said, I am your salvation. I need peace. I am your peace. We say I need. God says I am. We see him as our need. We know who we have. The source of every good and perfect gift, as James put it. But consider that as well. In verse 16, and going onward to verse 22, go and gather the elders of Israel together, and say to them, the Lord God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you, and seen what is done to you in Egypt, and I have said, I will bring you out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, Amorites, you get it, to the land of flowing with milk and honey. Then you will come, then they will heed your voice. This is when they'll listen to you. And you shall come, and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt, and you shall say to him, the Lord God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now, please, let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. No, not an unreasonable request. We'd come right back. But I am sure, God speaking about the future, that the king of Egypt will not let you go. No, not even by a mighty hand. It'll take some persuasion, and he'll still resist. So I'll stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst, and after that he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be, when you go, that you shall not go empty-handed. Now, they had been working in forced labor, right, for 400 years, which had only now had become literally taskmaster-driven slavery. And slavery implies no wages, correct? Well, every woman shall ask of her neighbor, namely of her who dwells in her house, articles of silver, gold, clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. So shall you plunder the Egyptians. They'd get paid, and they'd be on their way. This was not an act of robbery or looting, as anyone would consider it, or anything compared to what Simeon and Levi did by robbing the city that they slaughtered blind. But the Egyptians would compensate for all the times where they forced them to build cities without any pay, outside of just not getting whipped across the back. And God would be the one to see it done. And that's impressive that God predicts to Moses exactly what's going to happen. And we'll recap this again when we get there, so you guys will understand the context and circumstances as far as the minor details that happened in between. Now, chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, Moses answered and said, "But suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, 'The Lord has not appeared to you.' So the Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' He says, it's just a stick, it's a rod. And he said, 'Cast it on the ground.' So he cast it on the ground. It became a serpent. So Moses fled from it." I mean, I like snakes, but I'd be pretty freaked out too. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." Now, I live in Arizona, and we have a lot of interesting reptiles. That's the last place you want to grab it, because the business end's on the other end, and all the working parts are on that. So if you grab the snake by anywhere, it's probably going to be by the head so you can pin it down, right? You grab a dog by the ears so when it's struggling, the most dangerous part, the teeth, don't get at you, right? Same deal with the snake. God says, "You let me worry about the head." He reached out its head, it's on his hand, and it caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. So, first miracle to demonstrate to the children of Israel and to Pharaoh that a real God was the one giving him orders. Because what did the Egyptians like more than anything? What got their attention? Can you show us a trick? They loved their magic. So first routine, give life to that which was dead. First off, also transferring eukaryotic cells from prokaryotic ones. That's nothing short of miraculous too, but science terms aside. That they may believe the Lord God of their fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to you. Furthermore, God gave him 2 more tricks, where he said, put your hand under your shirt. When you pull it out, it'll be white, leprous, literally an incurable disease. Put it back in, pull it out, it'll be healthy. So making what was sick healthy, what was making healthy sick, and back again. And then lastly, he says, have them draw some water out of the river. Then when you pour it on the ground, it'll become blood when it splashes on dry land. And these would be the 3 signs. And Moses said to the Lord, "O Lord, I'm not eloquent, nor before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow to tongue." I relate to you, Moses. He's no personal public speaker. Neither am I, apparently. So the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes the mute, the deaf, the seen, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say." Essentially, God points out something that's very controversial. He points out to him that God makes people with disabilities the same reason why he makes people with gifts and talents. That, as he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26, "For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence." Why did God allow Moses to develop over these years a stutter, impaired method of speaking? Because it certainly wasn't his eloquence that won over the people of Israel, that there had to have been a God behind him for him to be able to lead a nation with a stuttering mouth. How could a man with so many infirmities, so many weaknesses, be possibly used by God if that God was something fake? And God says, that's the point. I use the weak people, I use the fools to put to shame the wise. I put the weak to put to shame the strong. Why? Because they can't brag about it. I'm the one who does it. We'll talk more about this when we get into Judges. Now, Moses finally kind of hits a nerve, and I don't frankly blame God on this part. He says, "Oh my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send." Moses just says, well, what if they don't believe me? Okay, Moses, do this, do this, do this. Clear enough? Well, I can't talk that well. I'll tell you what to say. I don't want to go. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know he can speak well, and look, he's coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him and put your words in his mouth. Well, I will be with your mouth, and I will be with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. He shall be your spokesman to the people, and himself shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as God." You'll be the representative of me for him. "And you take this rod in your hand, which you shall do the signs." Now, Moses' stick, Aaron's rod, wasn't anything special. It was the God that empowered it. But also consider the fact that God just gets annoyed at this point, and I would too. Aaron's older brother would speak for him, but it wouldn't change the calling that God had in his life. Even though it had to sort around a few more details, God said, "Look, Moses, I'm trying to bless you here. Stop getting so technical about a birthday present. Just open it, build it, put the batteries in, and enjoy it." You get the point? So, in verses 18 and going onward, down to, oh boy, verse 23, Moses meets Aaron along the way. Actually, first off, that's verse 27. Jethro comes back to his father-in-law and has quite a story to tell. And he says, "I got to go back to Egypt to tell him all these things, whether or not my brethren are still alive." So Jethro sends Moses off, "Go in peace." He doesn't just run away from home. The Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go, return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead." So prison sentence is over, both in my accounting and in theirs. And Moses took his wife and his sons, so he'd had more than one son, than Gershom, and set them on a donkey and returned to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the rod of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, "When you go back into Egypt, you do all these wonders which I have put into your hand, but I will harden his heart, so that you will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, the firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed, I will kill your son, your firstborn.'" Now, we'll talk more in detail about this and how God would make good on these claims at the Passover ceremony. He would take advantage of a chance to point to how he would end up giving his own son. But concerning these things also as fact, recognize it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. When we get into the passages, it'll mention time and time again, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart. But by the sixth time, it says, then God hardened Pharaoh's heart. God knows what decisions Pharaoh would make in advance, but he'll go on in future passages to say, "Have I not risen you up for this very purpose, that you would be a demonstration of my power and glory? But how you demonstrated it affected the way that I could use you." When we get into Romans and 1 Corinthians, about how some are vessels for honor and for dishonor, how some people use the spiritual gifts and a relationship with God to glorify his name. Other people glorify God either way, but they aren't blessed in the process because they're not willing to be active conduits. Just making things more difficult, which, again, you see with Moses here. But with all of these things pointed out in mind, we get to something very interesting, because God takes the commitments of his people pretty seriously. Verse 24, "It came to pass on the way that at the encampment that the Lord met him, sought to kill him." Now, how this happened, we don't know. Maybe he went into a seizure. Maybe they both saw the angel. Moses was like frozen in place or lifted up like Magneto or something. And the angel's getting ready to strike. And then it says in verse 25, then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son, no, just one of them, and cast it at Moses' feet and said, surely you are a husband of blood to me. So he, referring to the angel of the Lord, let him go. Then she said, you are a husband of blood because of the circumcision. Now remember, circumcision would be that special mark that would set apart God's people from the rest of the world. Moses had more than one son at this point, right? First was Gershom, and Moses had to explain to the missus, look, this is the thing that our customary families do. By the time the second baby came out, you could imagine Zipporah was like, you aren't touching my baby. You leave that business alone. And then they go on their way to Egypt, and Zipporah sees her husband getting ready to get killed by God, and she knows exactly what's going on, and this happened. Boy, drop your drawers! Takes the skin and throws it at her husband and says, there! You're a husband of blood to me. My goodness. That's gnarly. So, God takes his promises seriously. He'd set a good example for Egypt, and both his kids would be circumcised and set apart for God's holy covenant. They would not be considered part of God's people unless they were all dedicated in body and heart. So that was funny. Anyway, verse 27, the Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness and meet Moses. A little more or less persuasion on his part. So he went and met him on the mountain of God and kissed him. So Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord that had sent him and all the signs which he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron went, gathered the children of Israel and all the elders, and Aaron spoke all the words which God had spoken to Moses. Then he, Moses, did the signs in the sight of the people. So the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, that they had looked on their affliction, and then they bowed their heads and worshipped. And this is where we will take a time out to be continued, as Israel receives the good news that their deliverer has come. Now Pharaoh has got to be let in on it, which we will continue in the next study. But I want to thank you for listening to this one. If you have questions about what we've talked about, leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, leave a like and subscribe. It's a great encouragement. But most importantly, if you know someone who maybe hasn't heard these passages, heard them in context, if you'd like to become a part of this ministry and help God's word go out to those who wouldn't have heard it otherwise, please share this study with anyone and everyone that you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time listening to this study, and remember, regardless of circumstances or our cooperation in the matter, God loves you, Jesus loves you, and he has a plan for your life.